You don't belong in first class. This seat is for qualified passengers only." The words cut through the quiet luxury of the Apex Airlines cabin like a blade through silk. Victoria Reeves, senior flight attendant with 18 years of pristine service record and a heart full of ugly assumptions, stood over seat 1A with her arms crossed and her judgment written all over her face. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't being subtle. She wanted everyone in the first-class cabin to hear exactly what she thought about the young black woman sitting calmly in the premium seat. What Victoria didn't know was that the unqualified passenger she was about to humiliate owned more of this airline than she'd ever see in salary. Before we dive into this story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power privilege and the price of prejudice, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should be standard at 30,000 feet, smash that subscribe button and give this video a like. Now let's rewind to how this moment started. Naomi Baptiste walked through the jet bridge of Apex Airlines Flight 847 like she owned the place. Because technically she did. But nobody looking at her would know that. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been raised in boardrooms but educated in the real world. Her outfit was a masterclass in stealth wealth, a beige Brunello Cucinelli cashmere hoodie that cost more than most people's monthly rent, perfectly faded vintage Levi's, and Golden Goose sneakers that looked casual but carried a $600 price tag. To the untrained eye, she looked like any other graduate student flying home from a business conference. To the trained eye, every item she wore whispered luxury, but Victoria Reeves clearly possessed an untrained eye. The Boeing 777 first-class cabin smelled of leather and possibility. Naomi had grown up with this scent. These sounds, the gentle hum of wealth and comfort that came with private aviation. But today, as she settled into seat 1A, that familiar environment felt tainted by the cold stare boring into her from the galley. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her father, Dad. "The new seat leather feels cheap. We should upgrade to Poltrona Frau for the refit." She hit send and reached for the complimentary glass of champagne that had been placed on her armrest by Emma Rodriguez, a nervous-looking junior flight attendant who had already recognized something different about the passenger in 1A. Before Naomi's fingers could touch the crystal stem, Victoria's hand intercepted it. The movement wasn't violent, but it was firm, deliberate, and designed to humiliate. "I'm sorry, Miss Victoria," said her voice dripping with fake sweetness that fooled absolutely no one. "Complimentary beverages are for paying first-class passengers, not seat hoppers." Naomi paused, her hand still hovering in the air. She looked up, meeting Victoria's gaze with eyes that had stared down hostile takeovers and boardroom bullies. "I am a paying passenger. I'm in seat 1A. Victoria let out a short, dismissive laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Let's not play games today, honey. This isn't Spirit Airlines. We have standards here." She placed the champagne back on her tray, deliberately out of Naomi's reach. "If you're trying to snag a selfie for Instagram, you've got your shot. Now please, the economy cabin is boarding through door 2. You need to head back there before you block the aisle for our actual guests." The cabin was filling up around them. A heavy-set man in a bespoke suit took seat 1B across the aisle, watching the interaction over the rim of his Wall Street Journal with mild amusement. He didn't intervene. He just watched, entertained by what he clearly viewed as dinner theater. "I'm not playing games," Naomi said, her voice steady. She had been raised in hostile environments. She knew how to hold her ground without raising her voice. "My boarding pass is right here on my phone. Would you like to see it? I don't need to see a fake screenshot, sweetheart." Victoria snapped, dropping the customer service mask entirely. Her true face was uglier than the fake one. "Anyone can Photoshop a boarding pass. I know who belongs in this cabin and who doesn't. Seat 1A is reserved for a VIP guest, a corporate affiliate." She gestured vaguely at Naomi's hoodie, her lip curling in disgust. "Not someone like you." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Naomi felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from a controlled anger she had learned to channel into laser focus. She unlocked her phone with deliberate calm, her manicured fingers moving across the screen with practiced precision. "If you check your manifest," Naomi said, her voice never wavering, "you'll see the name N. Baptiste. That's me." Victoria rolled her eyes so hard they nearly fell out of her head. She turned her back to Naomi and addressed the man in 1B with exaggerated courtesy. "Mr. Sullivan, can I get you a refill? I apologize for the disturbance. We're dealing with a stowaway situation." Brad Sullivan, hedge fund manager and professional opportunist, looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man who had just discovered free entertainment. "Stowaway," he repeated loud enough for the growing audience to hear. "On a flight this expensive. How did security miss that stowaway?" Naomi repeated, unbuckling her seatbelt. She stood up slowly, every movement controlled and deliberate. She wasn't tall, but presence had nothing to do with height. "I need you to scan my boarding pass right now, or you can call your gate agent to verify." Victoria spun around, her face hardening like concrete in winter. She stepped into Naomi's personal space, close enough that Naomi could smell her cheap perfume and cheaper judgment. "Sit down now. You are disrupting the boarding process. If you do not grab your bag and move to economy row 34, where you likely belong, I will have you escorted off this plane by federal marshals." The threat came with a smile that never reached Victoria's eyes. "Do you understand what unqualified means? It means you don't have the status, the money, or the class to sit in that seat. You are unqualified to be in this environment." The word hung between them like a loaded weapon. Unqualified. It wasn't just an insult. It was a systematic erasure of everything Naomi had worked for, everything she had achieved, everything she was. It stripped away her MBA from Wharton, her summer internship at Goldman Sachs, her fluency in 3 languages, and her degree in international business. It reduced her to a stereotype, a caricature, a problem to be solved. But Victoria had just made a critical miscalculation. She had chosen that word while speaking to the daughter of Richard Baptiste, the man whose name was painted in gold letters on the side of the aircraft, the man whose signature was on Victoria's paychecks, the man who had built an aviation empire from nothing and was about to watch his daughter handle this situation with more grace than Victoria had shown in 18 years of service. Naomi stared at the woman who had just called her unqualified. She could end this right now. She could say, "My father is Richard Baptiste, the man who signs your paychecks." But something stopped her, a curiosity that had served her well in business school and would serve her even better now. If she played the "Do you know who I am?" card, Victoria would back down out of fear, not out of any genuine recognition of her own bias. Naomi wanted to see how deep this rot went. She wanted to see exactly how Victoria Reeves treated people she thought were powerless. She wanted to document every ugly word, every false assumption, every moment of institutional prejudice that would soon be broadcast to the world. "Call the marshals, then," Naomi said, sitting back down and crossing her legs with the calm of someone who had never doubted their right to exist in any space they chose to occupy. "I'm not moving." The Hermes Apple Watch band on her wrist caught the cabin light as she reached for her phone. The Bottega Veneta case that protected it was worth more than Victoria made in a week. But these weren't accessories designed to impress. They were tools of documentation evidence collectors, the digital weapons of a generation that refused to suffer in silence. The tension in the cabin became thick enough to choke on. Emma Rodriguez, the junior flight attendant who had served Naomi her champagne, looked terrified. She approached Victoria with the hesitant steps of someone walking through a minefield. Jessica Emma whispered urgently, tugging at Victoria's sleeve. "Maybe we should just check her boarding pass again." The scanner was glitching earlier during pre-boarding. "Quiet, Emma," Victoria hissed, swatting away the younger woman's hand like she was an annoying insect. "You're new. You don't understand how these people operate. They try to bluff their way into spaces they can't afford. Give them an inch and they'll take the whole plane. Watch and learn." Victoria marched to the front of the cabin and grabbed the intercom receiver with theatrical authority. She didn't call the federal marshals, though. She called the gate. "Derek, we have a situation in first class," Victoria said loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear every word. "I have a non-compliant passenger refusing to vacate a premium seat. She's becoming aggressive and threatening the crew." Naomi's eyebrows shot up. Aggressive? She hadn't moved from her seat since sitting back down. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened anyone. She pulled out her phone and started recording, not pointing it at Victoria's face yet, just letting it rest on her armrest, capturing audio and the growing circus around her. A moment later, Derek Walsh appeared at the aircraft door. The gate agent looked like middle management personified, thinning hair, cheap suit, and the permanent expression of someone who had given up on life but was still collecting paychecks. He walked down the aisle with the swagger of a small man who had finally been given a big stick. "What's the problem here?" Derek asked, looking first at Victoria, then at Naomi with the expression of someone who had already decided which side he was on. "She's in seat 1A," Victoria said, pointing an accusatory finger at Naomi like she was identifying a criminal in a lineup. "She refuses to show a valid ticket. She's been verbally abusive to the crew and she's delaying our departure time." Derek turned to Naomi with the weary expression of a man who dealt with problems like her every day. "Miss, if you're in the wrong seat, please just move. We have a tight connection window at Miami. Let's not make this a federal case." "I have my boarding pass right here," Naomi said, holding up her phone screen. The QR code was bright and clear, impossible to miss. She refused to scan it. She called me unqualified and a stowaway without checking a single document. Derek reached for the phone, but Victoria intercepted again, her movements sharp and aggressive. "Derek, she's probably using a spoofing app. Look at her." Victoria gestured at Naomi's outfit with obvious disgust. "Does she look like a corporate affiliate to you?" "The manifest says, N. Baptiste." "That's obviously a system error, or she hacked the name somehow. This seat is usually blocked for ownership family." Derek paused. He looked at Naomi again, taking in the hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers. He was weighing Victoria's 18 years of service against the evidence of his own eyes, and his eyes were clearly untrained. That hesitation was the dagger that cut through any pretense of fairness. "Ma'am," Derek said, his tone shifting to match Victoria's authority. "I'm going to need to see some additional identification. Credit card ID proof of purchase." Behind them, other passengers were beginning to take notice. A man in seat 2. A pulled out his phone and started recording. A woman across the aisle whispered to her companion, "This is getting ugly." Someone in the back said, "Is this really happening right now?" Brad Sullivan, still nursing his drink in 1B, decided to contribute his expertise. "If she really belonged here, wouldn't she have just shown her documents already?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Innocent people don't usually make such a fuss about proving their innocence." Victoria smiled like she had just won the lottery. "Exactly. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. That's exactly what I've been trying to explain." Naomi looked around the cabin at the growing audience of her humiliation. White faces stared back at her with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to obvious hostility. A few looked uncomfortable, but none looked like they were planning to intervene. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, extracting her driver's license and a black American Express Centurion card that carried no preset spending limit. She handed them to Derek with movements that radiated calm control. Derek examined the documents like a detective studying evidence at a crime scene. The name on both matched the boarding pass exactly. The credit card was real substantial and clearly belonged to someone with significant financial resources. But instead of acknowledging his error, Derek doubled down. "These could be fake. he said, holding up the ID to the light like he was some kind of forensic expert. Identity theft is a serious crime. We've had problems with people using stolen credentials to access premium services. Victoria nodded sagely. That's exactly what this is. She probably bought these documents online. You can get fake IDs anywhere these days. From somewhere in the economy boarding line, a voice called out, "What's the holdup up there?" The delay was becoming noticeable, the kind of disruption that airlines hate, and that generates complaints and missed connections. "We're handling a security situation," Victoria called back, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she was saving the airline from fraud. "Please remain patient while we resolve this matter." Naomi sat in the center of the storm, documenting everything, waiting for the moment when the people trying to destroy her credibility would finally destroy themselves. In Seat 3C, Carlos Rivera was getting the story of his career without even trying. The 34-year-old tech journalist had been heading home from a startup conference in London when he found himself witnessing what looked like corporate discrimination in real time. His fingers moved across his phone screen with practiced precision, live tweeting the incident as it unfolded. Watching at Apex Airlines crew accuse black passenger of fraud for sitting in first class. No evidence. Just assumptions. Thread incoming. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias. The tweet went live at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within 60 seconds, it had been retweeted by tech executives across Silicon Valley. Within 5 minutes, it had reached the feeds of civil rights activists, airline industry analysts, and social media influencers who specialized in exposing corporate bias. Carlos wasn't just observing anymore. He was documenting history. Update gate agent now claiming passengers' legal documents are probably fake. Credit card could be stolen. Meanwhile, passenger remains completely calm, complying with all requests. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias. Behind Carlos, Margaret Thompson was having her own awakening. The 67-year-old retired teacher from Phoenix had seen this movie before, had lived through the era when discrimination was legal and open. She had hoped those days were over, but watching Victoria Reeves operate was like stepping through a time machine. Margaret had been raised in the polite racism of the 1950s, where people said those people, instead of slurs and discrimination, came with a smile and a customer service voice. She recognized the techniques Victoria was using because she had seen them deployed against her own students, her own neighbors, her own friends back when the world was more honest about its ugliness. "This is wrong," Margaret whispered to the woman sitting next to her. "This is completely wrong." Emma Rodriguez stood frozen near the galley, watching her supervisor destroy a passenger's dignity with surgical precision. Emma had been working for Apex Airlines for only 6 months, but she had already noticed patterns in Victoria's behavior. The extra scrutiny for certain passengers. The sudden policy enforcement that seemed to target specific demographics. The way complaints about Victoria always seemed to disappear into administrative black holes. Emma knew what she was watching was wrong, but she also knew that Victoria had the power to end her career with a single negative evaluation. In the airline industry, senior flight attendants were queens of their domains, and Victoria ruled her kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in regulation velvet. But Emma also knew something Victoria didn't. She had been working the check-in counter that morning when the VIP passenger list had been updated. She had seen the name N. Baptiste highlighted in gold, marked with the notation Owner Family, Priority Processing. She had watched the computer automatically upgrade the seat selection and add complimentary service flags. Victoria wasn't just wrong. She was attacking someone the airline's computer had specifically flagged as untouchable. From his seat in 1B, Brad Sullivan was enjoying the entertainment more than he should have. The 45-year-old hedge fund manager had spent his career in environments where power meant everything and weakness was blood in the water. He saw what was happening to Naomi not as injustice, but as natural selection. In Brad's world, If you couldn't defend your position, you deserved to lose it. If you couldn't prove your worth immediately and overwhelmingly, you were probably worthless. He had built his fortune on these principles, and they had served him well in Manhattan's financial district. She should have just shown her documents immediately, Brad said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Innocent people don't usually make such a production out of proving their innocence. Victoria nodded gratefully. Finally, someone who understood proper protocol. But Brad Sullivan had just made his own critical error. He had aligned himself publicly with discrimination, and Carlos Rivera had caught every word on video. Update passenger in 1B now blaming the victim. Innocent people don't make a production out of proving innocence. This is getting uglier by the minute. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias, hashtag public shaming. Carlos's hashtag was gaining momentum. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias had been shared over 500 times in 10 minutes. Screenshots of his thread were appearing on Instagram stories. TikTok users were screen recording his tweets and adding their own commentary. The incident was going viral in real time, and none of the perpetrators had any idea they were about to become the main characters in a social media firestorm that would end careers and change company policy. Victoria Reeves, Derek Walsh, and Brad Sullivan were about to learn that in the age of smartphones and social media, discrimination was no longer a private matter between perpetrator and victim. It was a public performance, and the audience was keeping score. Victoria Reeves stood in the aisle of first class like a general surveying a battlefield she was certain she had already won. 18 years of service had taught her the rhythm of these confrontations. In her experience, people like Naomi always backed down eventually. They might put up a fight initially, but when faced with real authority, they crumbled. She had handled situations like this before, though never quite so publicly. Usually, a firm voice and the threat of security was enough to send questionable passengers scurrying back to their proper place in the aircraft hierarchy. But Naomi Baptiste was proving more stubborn than most. "I've been flying for 18 years, Victoria announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "I know who belongs in first class, and I know who's trying to game the system. This is my cabin. These are my passengers, and I have the authority to remove anyone who doesn't belong." Derek Walsh nodded in support, emboldened by Victoria's confidence and his own petty authority. "Company policy is very clear about seat assignments and passenger verification," he said, brandishing his clipboard like a weapon. "We can't just let anyone sit anywhere because they claim to have a ticket." Naomi looked up at the two of them with an expression that could have been amusement if the circumstances weren't so infuriating. "Interesting choice of words," she said quietly. "Game the system. That's an interesting way to describe a passenger sitting in their assigned seat. Assigned to who exactly?" Victoria shot back. "Because our manifest shows this seat reserved for a VIP passenger. And unless you're hiding a Fortune 500 CEO somewhere in that hoodie, I don't think you qualify." The comment drew a chuckle from Brad Sullivan, who was clearly enjoying the show. "Fortune 500 CEO," he repeated. "That's good. That's very good." From his seat in 3C, Carlos Rivera continued his live documentation, his fingers flying across his phone keyboard. Flight attendant now mocking passenger. "Unless you're hiding a Fortune 500 CEO in that hoodie." The cruelty is casual practiced. This is learned behavior. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias. Margaret Thompson had heard enough. The retired teacher stood up slowly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years dealing with bullies of all ages. "This is shameful," she said loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "This young woman has shown you her boarding pass, her identification, and her credit card. What more do you want from her? A blood test?" Victoria turned to face this unexpected challenge to her authority. "Ma'am, please remain seated. This is a crew matter, and passengers should not interfere with airline operations." "Airline operations?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising. "Is humiliating paying customers part of your standard operations? because if it is, I'll be sure to mention that in my review. Now see here, Brad Sullivan interjected, turning in his seat to face Margaret. The crew is just following protocol. If she really belonged here, this would have been resolved by now. The fact that it's dragging on suggests there's a real problem. Margaret stared at Brad with the expression of someone who had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. The only problem I see is 2 airline employees and 1 passenger ganging up on a young woman who has done nothing wrong. Victoria's face was beginning to show cracks in her confident facade. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. Usually, the other passengers either ignored the confrontation or supported the crew's authority. Having a customer publicly challenge her decisions was throwing off her rhythm. "Ma'am Victoria," said her voice taking on a sharper edge, "if you continue to disrupt this process, I'll have to ask you to change seats as well." Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Change seats? For defending a passenger who's being treated like a criminal for the crime of being black in first class? I don't think so." The word hung in the air like a bomb everyone had seen coming but hoped wouldn't explode. Black. Margaret had said what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't about documents or seat assignments or airline policy. This was about race, pure and simple. Emma Rodriguez felt something break inside her chest. The young flight attendant had been raised to respect authority, to follow chain of command, to never question her supervisors. But she was also raised to recognize right from wrong, and what she was watching was simply wrong. "Victoria," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should just—" "Emma, quiet," Victoria snapped without looking back. "You're here to learn, not to question." But Emma was learning. She was learning that some authority wasn't worth respecting. She was learning that some chains of command led straight to hell. And she was learning that sometimes the right thing to do was the thing that would probably cost her job. Naomi sat in the center of the storm, documenting everything with the calm of someone who knew exactly how this would end. She wasn't recording for revenge. She was recording for evidence. Because when this was over, when the truth came out, when the consequences started falling like dominoes, she wanted there to be no doubt about what had happened and who was responsible. "You're right," Naomi said quietly, looking directly at Victoria. "I am unqualified." Victoria smiled triumphantly. "I'm unqualified." Naomi continued to tolerate this treatment from employees of my family's airline. The smile disappeared. The words hit the cabin like lightning striking clear sky. Victoria's triumphant expression froze on her face as the implications of what Naomi had just said began to penetrate her consciousness. But instead of backing down, instead of questioning her assumptions, Victoria doubled down with the desperation of someone who had just realized they might be standing on quicksand. "Your family's airline." Victoria laughed, but it came out shrill and forced. "That's rich. That's really rich. Let me guess, your daddy is the CEO of American. Your uncle runs Delta. Your cousin owns Southwest." Derek Walsh joined in the mockery encouraged by Victoria's confidence. "These people always claim connections they don't have," he said, checking his clipboard again. "It's textbook behavior. Make up some family connection. Hope it scares us into backing down." Brad Sullivan turned fully around in his seat, no longer content to be a passive observer. "Young lady," he said with the condescending tone he usually reserved for his daughter's friends, "making false claims about airline ownership is probably illegal. You're digging yourself into a deeper hole." But Margaret Thompson wasn't buying it anymore. "How do you know her claims are false?" she demanded. "Have you checked? Have you made any calls? Have you verified anything? Or are you just assuming she's lying because of how she looks?" Victoria's face flushed red. "I don't assume anything based on appearances. I go by facts. And the fact is, Ownership family members don't dress like they're going to a basketball game. That was the moment Victoria Reeves crossed the point of no return. Carlos Rivera's fingers paused over his phone screen as he processed what he had just heard. Then he began typing with renewed fury. Flight attendant just said ownership family members don't dress like they're going to a basketball game. The racial coding is no longer subtle. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias. Hashtag discrimination. The tweet exploded across social media. Screenshots flooded Instagram. TikTok videos began appearing with titles like Flight Attendant Says the Quiet Part Out Loud and Racism at 30,000 feet. Emma Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. She recognized that phrase had heard it used in the employee break room when certain passengers weren't around to hear it. Basketball game. Urban clothing. Those people. The coded language that let employees express prejudice while maintaining plausible deniability. But there was nothing deniable about what Victoria had just said. "I need to call security," Victoria announced, reaching for her radio. "This passenger is now claiming false airline ownership and disrupting other passengers. We need to have her removed immediately." "Call them," Naomi said calmly. "But while you're at it, maybe you should call your supervisor, too. I have a feeling they'll want to know how their employees are treating passengers today." Victoria paused radio halfway to her mouth. Something in Naomi's tone had changed. The calm was still there, but underneath it was something else. Confidence. Not the confidence of someone trying to bluff their way out of trouble, but the confidence of someone who knew exactly what cards they were holding. My supervisor, Victoria, laughed nervously. "Honey, I am the supervisor. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. The captain defers to me on cabin matters. There's no one higher on this plane." "On this plane," Naomi repeated thoughtfully. "That's true, but we're still at the gate, aren't we? Still connected to the airport, still connected to corporate headquarters." Derek Walsh was growing nervous. The situation had gone on too long, drawn too much attention. Other passengers were openly staring now, some recording, some whispering to each other. The boarding process had come to a complete halt. "Look," Derek said, trying to regain control. "Let's just resolve this quickly. Miss, if you have legitimate documents, show them again. If not, we need to get you to your proper seat so we can continue boarding." Naomi reached for her phone, but not to show documents. Instead, she opened her contacts list and scrolled to a number she rarely needed to call during business hours. The name at the top of her favorites list read simply, "Dad, Office." "I have a better idea." Naomi set her finger hovering over the call button. "Why don't we call someone who can clear this up immediately? Someone with the authority to verify exactly who I am and exactly where I belong on this aircraft." Victoria scoffed, but there was less confidence in it now. "Call whoever you want. The Easter Bunny Santa Claus, your imaginary airline executive friend. It won't change the facts." Naomi smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "You're absolutely right. It won't change the facts. The facts are about to become very clear to everyone." She pressed the call button and activated the speakerphone so everyone could hear. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a crisp professional voice answered with the kind of authority that cut through corporate hierarchies like a hot knife through butter. Richard Baptiste speaking. The voice filled the first-class cabin with immediate, unmistakable authority. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone whose words carried the weight of institutional power and decades of successful leadership. It was also a voice that Derek Walsh recognized immediately. Derek's face went white. His clipboard clattered to the floor. But Victoria, either too committed to her course or too obtuse to recognize the name, pressed forward with aggressive confidence. "Sir, this is Victoria Reeves, senior flight attendant on Apex Airlines Flight 847. I have a passenger here claiming to be related to airline ownership. She's disrupting our boarding process and making false claims about Victoria." The voice interrupted with ice-cold precision. I want you to stop talking immediately and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Victoria's mouth snapped shut, but her expression remained defiant. The passenger you are harassing is my daughter, Naomi Baptiste. She is seated in first class because she is authorized to be there. She is authorized to be there because I authorized it. And I authorized it because I own this airline. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Victoria stared at the phone in Naomi's hand like it was a venomous snake. Derek Walsh had gone from white to green, looking like he was about to be sick all over his clipboard. Brad Sullivan's newspaper rustled as his hands began to shake. But Victoria, displaying either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity, decided to challenge a voice she still couldn't quite accept as real. Sir, with all due respect, anyone can claim to be anyone on a phone call. This passenger has been disruptive and aggressive since boarding. She's wearing inappropriate clothing for first class and her documentation appears questionable. Carlos Rivera stopped breathing. Margaret Thompson's hand flew to her mouth. Emma Rodriguez closed her eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer. The silence from the phone stretched for 5 full seconds. When Richard Baptiste spoke again, his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made corporate executives update their resumes. Victoria Reeves, employee ID 4477, hired March 15, 2006, currently earning $68,000 annually plus flight pay. Your direct supervisor is Patricia Michaels, Chief of Cabin Services. Your last performance review was rated satisfactory with notes about improved passenger relations needed. Would you like me to continue, or do you now believe that I have access to employee records? Victoria's face drained of all color. Derek Walsh, Gate Agent, Employee ID 2291, hired August 3, 2019, currently on probation for customer service complaints. Your supervisor is James Chen, Ground Operations Manager. You've received 3 written warnings in the past 18 months for unprofessional conduct. Should I pull up the specific incidents? Derek dropped his radio. Now, Richard continued, his voice carrying across the cabin like Judgment Day. I want both of you to listen carefully. You have just publicly humiliated my daughter on an aircraft that I own in front of passengers who are now broadcasting this incident to the world using language that exposes this company to significant legal liability. Victoria tried to speak, but Richard cut her off. I'm not finished. Not. My daughter has shown you valid identification, a legitimate boarding pass, and a credit card with her name on it. She has complied with every request you've made. She has remained calm and professional while you have treated her like a criminal. And your justification for this treatment appears to be entirely based on your personal assumptions about who belongs in first class. Margaret Thompson nodded vigorously. That's exactly right, she said loud enough for the phone to pick up. Thank you, ma'am. Richard's voice responded. I appreciate passengers who are willing to speak up against injustice. Now, Victoria and Derek, here's what's going to happen next. The cabin waited. You're both fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft when this call ends. Your employee access has been revoked, your benefits terminated, and your final paychecks will be mailed to your addresses on file. Victoria finally found her voice. You can't do this. I have union protection. I have seniority. This is wrongful termination. This is termination for cause, Richard corrected. Discrimination against passengers based on race is grounds for immediate dismissal according to both company policy and federal employment law. Your union contract specifically excludes protection for discriminatory behavior. Derek tried a different approach. Sir, we were just following company policy about verifying passenger credentials. Derek, Richard said with deadly calm, company policy requires you to scan boarding passes and check identification when requested. It does not require you to declare valid documents fraudulent. It does not permit you to refuse service based on clothing choices. And it certainly doesn't authorize you to call paying passengers stowaways. Emma Rodriguez stepped forward. her voice shaking but determined. "Sir, I witnessed the entire incident. Ms. Baptiste was completely professional. She showed her documents multiple times. Victoria refused to scan her boarding pass and made assumptions based on appearance." "Thank you, Emma. What's your full name and employee ID? Emma Rodriguez ID, 7739? "Emma, you're being promoted to senior flight attendant, effective immediately. Your willingness to speak truth to power is exactly the kind of leadership this company needs." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Brad Sullivan, meanwhile, was calculating how much damage control he would need to do when this story broke. He was already mentally drafting apologies and considering which charities he should suddenly start supporting. But Richard Baptiste wasn't finished with the accountability session. "I also want to address the passenger in Seat 1B who felt comfortable blaming the victim and supporting discriminatory treatment." Brad's heart stopped. "Mr. Sullivan, your company's relationship with Baptiste Aviation Group is under immediate review. We'll be reevaluating all contracts and considering whether we want to continue doing business with organizations whose executives publicly support discrimination against our passengers." "Now, wait just a minute," Brad sputtered, but Richard cut him off. "I don't wait, Mr. Sullivan. I act. And I'm acting by ensuring that every person who contributed to my daughter's humiliation faces appropriate consequences." Carlos Rivera was typing furiously, documenting every moment of corporate accountability in real time. His followers were sharing his updates faster than he could post them. Hashtag Apex Airlines bias was trending nationwide, and the story was being picked up by major news outlets. The incident had gone from a local confrontation to a national conversation about discrimination in corporate America, and Richard Baptiste was just getting started. As Victoria and Derek stood frozen in the aftermath of Richard Baptiste's verbal demolition, the cabin atmosphere began to shift like a weather system moving through. The other passengers who had been watching the confrontation with varying degrees of discomfort and entertainment suddenly found themselves forced to pick sides in a very public reckoning. Margaret Thompson stood up from her seat, her 67 years of experience reading human nature on full display. "I want everyone on this plane to know that I watched this entire situation unfold," she announced in her clear teacher's voice. "This young woman did nothing wrong. Nothing. She was polite, she was calm, and she provided every document requested. What happened here was discrimination pure and simple." A murmur ran through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, and a few seemed surprised that someone was willing to name what they had all witnessed. Carlos Rivera seized the moment, standing up with his phone still recording. "For those watching the live stream, we just heard the owner of this airline fire 2 employees in real time for discriminating against his daughter. This is what accountability looks like." But Brad Sullivan wasn't ready to accept accountability. The hedge fund manager turned in his seat, his face red with indignation and panic. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, his voice carrying the entitled authority of someone who had never been challenged in public before. "We don't know this is really the owner. Anyone can claim to be anyone. For all we know, this is an elaborate con job." Several passengers turned to stare at Brad with expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. "A con job," Margaret repeated, her voice rising. "You think she paid someone to impersonate an airline owner just so she could—" "What? Sit in a seat she already paid for. Do you hear yourself?" Emma Rodriguez, emboldened by her sudden promotion and the support of the actual airline owner, stepped into the conversation. "Sir, I can confirm that Mr. Baptiste's voice is authentic. I've heard him on company conference calls. And I can also confirm that Miss Baptiste's reservation was flagged in our system as VIP owner family." Brad's panic was becoming more visible by the second. He could see his business relationships crumbling in real time, could imagine the phone calls he'd receive from his partners, could visualize his name trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. "Look, I was just trying to support the crew," he said, his voice getting higher and more defensive. "I thought they knew what they were doing." How was I supposed to know? You were supposed to know better, interrupted a voice from row 2. The speaker was Dr. Patricia Valdez, a civil rights attorney flying home from a conference in London. You were supposed to know better than to assume a black woman in first class must be there illegally. You were supposed to know better than to join a mob attacking someone for the crime of existing while black. The word mob hung in the air like an accusation that fit too perfectly to ignore. From the phone, which was still connected, Richard Baptiste's voice cut through the growing tension. I want to address something for all the passengers listening. What you witnessed today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a window into a pattern of behavior that exists throughout the travel industry and corporate America. The cabin fell silent again. My daughter could have avoided this entire situation by immediately identifying herself as the owner's daughter. But she chose not to because she wanted to see how our employees treat passengers they believe have no power, no connections, no ability to fight back. Naomi nodded, speaking for the first time since the call began. I wanted to document how people like Victoria treat people they think are powerless. Because if they'll treat the owner's daughter this way, imagine how they treat everyone else. A businessman in row 3 shifted uncomfortably. But if you had just said who you were from the beginning, then nothing would have changed, Margaret interrupted. The crew would have apologized out of fear not understanding. The discrimination would have continued just more carefully. This way, everyone sees the truth. Carlos was still filming his live stream audience now in the tens of thousands. This is bigger than one incident on one flight, he said to his camera. This is about the power of documentation, the importance of witnesses, and the consequences of staying silent when you see injustice. But the most powerful moment came from an unexpected source. A young Hispanic woman in row 4 who had been silent throughout the entire confrontation finally spoke up. I fly this route every month for work, she said, her voice quiet but clear. I've seen this flight attendant before. I've seen her treat people differently based on how they look, how they dress, what language they speak. I never said anything because I was afraid she'd target me next. Victoria, who was still standing in the aisle awaiting her security escort, whipped around. That's not true. I treat all passengers equally. No, you don't. The woman continued, her confidence growing. You questioned my documents last month. You made me move seats even though my ticket was valid. You told me I must have made a mistake because passengers like me don't usually book first class. Another passenger nodded. I remember that. I saw it happen and I should have said something. The confessions began to cascade. Passenger after passenger began sharing their observations of Victoria's behavior, their own experiences with discrimination, their regret at staying silent when they should have spoken up. Emma Rodriguez listened to the testimonies with growing horror and determination. This stops now, she said firmly. When I'm senior flight attendant, this stops completely. Victoria looked around the cabin at the faces of passengers and crew members who were no longer afraid to speak truth to her power. For the first time in 18 years of service, she was the one without support, without authority, without the ability to control the narrative. The mob mentality had turned, but this time it was turning toward justice instead of complicity. Victoria Reeves, faced with the complete collapse of her authority and the growing chorus of passenger testimony against her, decided to make one final attempt at regaining control. If she was going down, she would go down swinging, using every weapon in the corporate arsenal of intimidation and false legal authority. This is all very convenient, Victoria said, her voice taking on a shrill, desperate edge. A passenger makes a phone call to someone claiming to be the airline owner, and suddenly everyone believes this elaborate story. But I have news for all of you. I have federal authority on this aircraft. I can have anyone removed for disrupting flight operations, and that includes passengers who make false claims and encourage others to lie. Derek Walsh, despite his earlier panic, saw Victoria's strategy as his potential salvation. She's absolutely right, he said, picking up his dropped radio. We have protocols for dealing with passenger fraud and document forgery. These are federal offenses. The FBI investigates airline security breaches. Brad Sullivan, desperate to rehabilitate his image and distance himself from the discrimination, jumped on the legal authority bandwagon. Exactly. If her documents were real, why would the crew question them? Airline employees are trained to spot fraudulent credentials. They must have seen something suspicious. But Margaret Thompson had heard enough legal intimidation tactics to recognize them for what they were. Federal authority. She repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. Federal authority to discriminate against passengers based on race. Federal authority to ignore valid documents. Federal authority to call paying customers stowaways. Carlos Rivera, still live streaming, provided real-time fact-checking for his growing audience. For viewers just joining, flight attendants have authority over safety issues, not civil rights violations. They can't arrest people for being black in first class. From the phone speaker, Richard Baptiste's voice cut through the legal posturing like a sword through smoke. Since we're discussing federal authority, let me share some actual legal facts. The Department of Transportation prohibits discrimination in air travel based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or ancestry. What my daughter experienced today violates federal civil rights law. Victoria's face flushed red. We weren't discriminating. We were following security protocols. Security protocols, Richard repeated coldly, that apparently only apply to black passengers wearing hoodies. Tell me, Victoria, how many white passengers have you asked for additional documentation this month? The question hung in the air like a challenge Victoria couldn't meet. Emma Rodriguez, feeling the protection of her new position and the backing of the actual company owner, stepped forward with information that would destroy Victoria's last defense. Sir, I need to share something. I've worked with Victoria for 6 months, and I've seen her apply security protocols selectively. She's never asked white passengers for additional verification, even when their tickets had actual technical problems. That's a lie, Victoria snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. It's documented, Emma continued. I have notes from every flight we've worked together, because I was preparing to file a discrimination complaint with HR. I was afraid to file it because Victoria told me that complaints against senior crew members always result in the complainant being fired. Dr. Valdez, the civil rights attorney in row 2, leaned forward with professional interest. That sounds like witness intimidation and retaliation, both of which are illegal under federal employment law. Derek Walsh, seeing the legal walls closing in, decided to throw Victoria completely under the bus. I want everyone to know that I was just following the flight attendant's lead. She told me the passenger was suspicious. I don't make those determinations myself. Coward Margaret muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. But Victoria wasn't done fighting. Faced with professional destruction, she decided to deploy the nuclear option of corporate intimidation. Fine. You want to play legal games? I'm calling the federal air marshals. Passengers who make false claims about airline ownership and encourage others to file false reports are engaging in terrorism activities. The cabin erupted in shocked murmurs. Even Brad Sullivan looked stunned by the escalation. Carlos stopped typing mid-tweet. Did she just call civil rights documentation terrorism? Yes, Dr. Valdez said grimly. She did. And that's going to be quoted in the lawsuit. From the phone speaker, Richard's voice carried a new edge of controlled fury. Victoria Reeves, you have just accused my daughter of terrorism for the crime of being black in first class. You have threatened to involve federal law enforcement in what is clearly a civil rights violation. And you have done all of this while being broadcast live to thousands of people. Victoria's hand shook as she reached for her radio. I'm calling airport security. This passenger has created a disturbance, made false claims, and is now threatening the crew with legal action. Go ahead, Naomi said calmly, speaking directly to Victoria for the first time since her father had joined the conversation. Call security. Call the air marshals. Call the FBI if you want. I have video documentation of everything you've said and done. I have witness testimony from multiple passengers. And I have my father, the owner of this airline, confirming my identity and my right to be here." Victoria stared at Naomi, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of her mistake. "You know what the interesting thing is?" Naomi continued, her voice steady and measured. "You keep talking about federal authority and legal protocols and security procedures, but you haven't once mentioned treating passengers with basic human dignity. You haven't once acknowledged that you might have been wrong. You haven't once considered that maybe, just maybe, a black woman in first class might actually belong there." The truth of Naomi's words settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Derek Walsh was the first to crack completely. "Look, I'm sorry. Okay, I made a mistake. I trusted the flight attendant's judgment and I was wrong. Can we just fix this and move on?" "You can't unmake a viral video," Carlos said, still recording. "You can't take back discrimination that's been broadcast to 50,000 people and counting." Margaret nodded firmly. "Some mistakes have consequences. This is one of them." Victoria looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at her. Passengers who had seen through her false authority, crew members who no longer respected her leadership, and security footage that would document her behavior forever. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria Reeves was powerless, and everyone knew it. Airport security arrived at the aircraft door with the heavy footsteps of authority figures who had been summoned to resolve what they believed was a standard passenger disturbance. Officer James Mitchell, a 20-year veteran of airport security, stepped into the first-class cabin expecting to find the usual scenario: an intoxicated passenger, someone with expired documents, or maybe a simple seat assignment dispute that had gotten out of hand. What he found instead was a cabin full of passengers with their phones out, a flight attendant who looked like she was about to have a breakdown, and a gate agent who was sweating through his polyester uniform despite the aircraft's air conditioning. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Mitchell asked, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had dealt with thousands of aircraft disruptions. Victoria lunged toward him like a drowning person grasping for a life preserver. "Officer, thank God you're here. We have a passenger who has been disruptive and aggressive. She's making false claims about airline ownership, refusing to provide valid documentation, and encouraging other passengers to file false reports against the crew." Derek nodded eagerly. "She's been verbally abusive and threatening. We need her removed from the aircraft immediately." Officer Mitchell looked at Naomi, who was sitting calmly in seat 1A with her phone in her lap and her hands visible on the armrests. She didn't look disruptive. She didn't look aggressive. She looked like someone patiently waiting for common sense to prevail. "Ma'am," Mitchell said to Naomi, "I'm going to need to see your identification and boarding documents." "Of course," Naomi replied, reaching for her purse. "I've been trying to show these to the crew for the past 20 minutes. As Naomi handed over her documents, Margaret Thompson stood up again. "Officer, I need you to know that I've watched this entire incident from the beginning. This young woman has been completely cooperative. The crew has been the aggressive party." Dr. Valdez joined Margaret in standing. "I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law. What I've witnessed here is clear discrimination based on race. This passenger has valid documents and has committed no crime." Officer Mitchell examined Naomi's driver's license, credit card, and boarding pass. Everything was in order. Everything matched. Everything was legitimate. He had seen thousands of fake documents in his career, and these weren't fake. But Victoria wasn't ready to surrender. "Officer, those documents could be forgeries. We've had problems with people using sophisticated fake IDs to access premium services. You need to run them through your verification system." Carlos Rivera, still streaming to his massive live audience, provided commentary for his viewers. Security is now being used to intimidate a passenger whose only crime was flying while black. The documents are obviously legitimate, but the crew is demanding additional verification. From the phone speaker, which was still connected, Richard Baptiste's voice filled the cabin with unmistakable authority. "Officer Mitchell, This is Richard Baptiste, chairman of Baptiste Aviation Group. I can verify that you are speaking to my daughter Naomi Baptiste, who is authorized to be on this aircraft and in that seat." Officer Mitchell's demeanor changed immediately. He recognized the name, recognized the voice, and suddenly understood that he was standing in the middle of a corporate disaster rather than a routine passenger issue. Sir Mitchell said into the phone, "I can confirm that all of her documents appear authentic and valid." "They are authentic and valid," Richard replied, "because she is exactly who she says she is, sitting exactly where she belongs, being harassed by employees who are about to be terminated." But Victoria, in a final desperate gambit, decided to escalate to the highest possible level. "Officer, I don't care who's on that phone. I have 18 years of experience and I'm telling you this passenger is a security risk. I'm requesting that she be removed from the aircraft and held for federal investigation." The cabin fell silent. Victoria had just demanded that the owner's daughter be arrested. Brad Sullivan, finally recognizing how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation, tried to distance himself from the discrimination he had previously supported. "Now wait a minute. Maybe we're all overreacting here. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." "A misunderstanding," Margaret repeated incredulously. "A misunderstanding that just happened to target the only black passenger in First Class A. Misunderstanding that involved questioning legitimate documents, making false accusations, and threatening arrest. That's a very convenient misunderstanding, Mr. Sullivan." Emma Rodriguez, emboldened by her new position and disgusted by Victoria's escalation, stepped forward to provide the testimony that would end the confrontation once and for all. "Officer Mitchell," Emma said clearly, "I need to report that Senior Flight Attendant Victoria Reeves has been discriminating against passengers based on race throughout her tenure. I have documented evidence of her selective enforcement of policies, her use of coded racist language, and her intimidation of crew members who question her behavior." Victoria whirled around to face Emma. "You're lying. You're just trying to save your own job." "I've already been promoted," Emma replied calmly, "by the actual owner of the airline. I don't need to lie to save my job. I'm telling the truth to save my conscience." Officer Mitchell looked around the cabin at the multiple witnesses, the ongoing live stream, the phone call with the verified airline owner, and the mountain of evidence pointing to a clear case of discrimination. He made his decision. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me. You're being removed from the aircraft pending an investigation." Victoria stared at him in shock. "You're removing me. I'm the crew member I called you. She's the problem." "No, ma'am," Officer Mitchell replied firmly. "You're the problem. And you're off this flight." As Officer Mitchell escorted Victoria toward the aircraft door, Carlos Rivera's live stream exploded beyond anything he had ever experienced as a tech journalist. What had started as a thread about airline discrimination had become a real-time masterclass in accountability, corporate responsibility, and the power of social media to expose injustice. "Guys, you're witnessing history," Carlos said to his phone camera, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "We just watched a flight attendant get arrested for discriminating against the airline owner's daughter. This is what happens when racism meets reality in the age of smartphones." The hashtag Apex Airlines bias had exploded beyond trending into cultural phenomenon territory. Hashtag Unqualified passenger was generating thousands of posts per minute. TikTok users were screen recording Carlos's live stream and adding their own commentary. Instagram influencers were sharing screenshots with captions about corporate accountability and civil rights. But the most powerful viral moment came when Naomi herself began to speak directly to Carlos's camera, with her father still connected on the speakerphone. "I want people to understand something," Naomi said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of experience beyond her 26 years. "This doesn't happen because I'm special. This doesn't happen because my father owns the airline. This happens because I had the resources to fight back the privilege to document it safely and the platform to make it public. Richard's voice from the phone added context that sent shockwaves through the live audience. My daughter is right. For every incident like this that gets recorded and goes viral, there are hundreds that happen in silence to passengers who don't have the power to fight back. Margaret Thompson, still standing in the aisle, addressed the camera directly. I'm 67 years old. I lived through the civil rights era. I thought we had made more progress than this. Watching this young woman be treated like a criminal for existing while black in first class, it breaks my heart and it makes me angry. The comment section of Carlos's live stream became a digital town hall. Thousands of viewers shared their own experiences with airline discrimination. Flight attendants and gate agents began anonymously sharing stories about pressure to profile passengers. Civil rights organizations started resharing the stream with calls for industry-wide reform. Dr. Valdez, speaking as both a witness and a legal expert, provided analysis that went viral in its own right. What you're seeing is institutional racism in action. It's not one bad employee. It's a system that enables and protects discriminatory behavior. Notice how the gate agent immediately supported the flight attendant without question. Notice how multiple staff members doubled down instead of investigating. That's not coincidence. That's culture. Emma Rodriguez, still processing her sudden promotion and the weight of speaking truth to power, shared a perspective that resonated with service industry workers across the country. I want other airline employees watching this to know that you don't have to stay silent. You don't have to participate in discrimination to keep your job. There are good companies and good leaders who will support you for doing the right thing. The viral moment reached critical mass when other airline passengers began sharing their own videos. A woman in Phoenix posted a TikTok about being questioned for flying first class while wearing a hijab. A man in Chicago shared his experience being asked for additional documentation when flying with his interracial family. A college student in Atlanta posted about being removed from premium seating and told she looked like she was in the wrong section. Carlos's follower count was increasing by the thousands in real time. News outlets were reaching out for interviews. Corporate communication teams at airlines across the country were holding emergency meetings. But perhaps the most impactful viral moment came when Brad Sullivan, recognizing that his earlier comments were being screen recorded and shared across platforms, attempted to rehabilitate his image with an apology that backfired spectacularly. I want everyone to know that I'm not a racist, Brad said to Carlos's camera. I was just trying to support what I thought was proper airline security. I made a mistake in judgment, and I sincerely apologize. The response from the live stream audience was immediate and brutal. Comments flooded in, calling out the performative nature of his apology, the convenient timing of his change of heart, and the underlying assumptions that had led him to support discrimination in the first place. Dr. Valdez provided the perfect legal commentary. Notice how his apology focuses on his intent rather than his impact. Notice how he's more concerned with his reputation than with the harm he contributed to. That's privilege in action. Margaret Ever, the teacher, used the moment as an educational opportunity. Children, this is what happens when adults are more worried about being called racist than about actually being racist. Real accountability means changing behavior, not just managing public relations. The viral storm was generating real-world consequences in real time. Apex Airlines' stock price was dropping. Other airlines were issuing preemptive statements about their commitment to inclusive service. Civil rights organizations were announcing investigations into discrimination in the airline industry. Most importantly, passengers across the country were pulling out their phones ready to document their own experiences with discrimination. The age of silent suffering was ending, replaced by an era of instant accountability and viral justice. Carlos looked into his camera one final time as the situation in the cabin began to stabilize. This is what change looks like in 2024, not through formal complaints that get buried in corporate bureaucracy, but through real-time documentation that can't be ignored or covered up. Every phone is now a weapon against injustice. The revolution was being live-streamed, and the world was watching. As the cabin began to settle into an uneasy calm following Victoria's removal and the viral explosion of social media coverage, Naomi realized that the public accountability was only the beginning. The real work of institutional change required more than firing individual employees. It required addressing the culture that had created and protected them. "Dad," she said to the phone that was still connected on speaker, "I think we need to have a broader conversation about what happened here today." Richard's voice came through with the weight of someone who had spent decades building a business empire and understood that single incidents often revealed deeper institutional problems. "I agree completely. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a symptom of organizational culture that we need to address comprehensively." Margaret Thompson, who had become an unofficial spokesperson for the passenger's perspective, nodded approvingly. This young woman handled herself with more grace than most adults twice her age. But the fact that she had to handle it at all is the real problem. Dr. Valdez leaned forward, her legal mind already working through the implications. From a civil rights perspective, what we witnessed suggests patterns of behavior that likely extend beyond this single flight crew. The confidence with which they acted, the automatic support they received from ground staff, the assumption that their version would be believed, that indicates institutional acceptance of discriminatory behavior. Emma Rodriguez, still processing her rapid promotion from junior crew member to senior flight attendant, raised a concern that would prove crucial to the conversation. "Sir, I want to share something that might be important. During my training, we were taught to be extra vigilant about passengers who didn't fit the profile of typical first-class travelers. The language was coded, but the message was clear." The cabin fell silent as the implications of Emma's revelation sank in. Carlos, still live-streaming to his massive audience, provided real-time analysis. "So this isn't just about individual bias. This is about training programs that institutionalize discrimination. This is about corporate policies that encode racism into standard operating procedures." Richard's voice carried a new edge of controlled anger. "Emma, I want you to preserve any training materials, policy documents, or communications that support what you just described. We're going to need comprehensive evidence if we're going to reform this properly." But the most powerful moment of the setup came when other passengers began sharing their own observations and experiences, creating a real-time focus group on discrimination in air travel. A businessman in row 3 who had remained silent throughout the confrontation finally spoke up. "I fly this route monthly for work. I've seen patterns of behavior that I rationalized as normal customer service, but listening to this conversation, I think I've been witnessing discrimination and telling myself it was something else." His admission opened floodgates. Other passengers began sharing observations about selective security screening different service levels based on appearance and subtle but consistent patterns of differential treatment. Margaret, drawing on her decades of experience as an educator, helped facilitate the discussion with the skill of someone who had spent her career helping people recognize and articulate difficult truths. "What you're all describing is how institutional discrimination works. It's not always dramatic confrontations like what we saw with Victoria. More often, it's small daily indignities that add up to a hostile environment." Dr. Valdez provided legal context that elevated the conversation beyond individual experiences to constitutional principles. The Civil Rights Act doesn't just prohibit dramatic incidents of discrimination. It prohibits the creation of hostile environments based on protected characteristics. What you're all describing could constitute a pattern of civil rights violations. But the setup reached its crucial turning point when Naomi herself began to articulate her vision for change, speaking with the authority of someone who would soon have the power to implement real reform. This conversation we're having right now, passengers, crew members, and management talking honestly about discrimination, this is what needs to happen company-wide. not as a response to crisis but as ongoing practice. Richard's voice carried paternal pride mixed with business acumen. Naomi, I want you to lead that initiative. I want you to design and implement a comprehensive program to address discrimination across all our operations. Emma raised her hand like she was still in school. Sir, would that program include protection for employees who report discrimination? Because I can tell you that crew members are afraid to speak up about problematic behavior from senior staff. Absolutely, Richard replied. And I want you to help design those protections, Emma. You've shown courage today that we need to cultivate throughout the organization. Carlos looked into his camera, addressing his live stream audience. You're witnessing the birth of what could become a model for corporate accountability. This isn't just about punishing bad actors. This is about building systems that prevent discrimination from taking root in the first place. The phone call was evolving from crisis management into strategic planning, setting the stage for revelations that would transform not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to civil rights and customer service. The moment had arrived for the complete unveiling of truth that would shift every power dynamic in the cabin and expose the full magnitude of the errors made by Victoria Derrick and their enablers. Richard Baptiste's voice carried across the first-class cabin with the authority of someone about to reveal information that would change everything. I think it's time for everyone to understand exactly who they've been talking to today. Richard said, his voice carrying both pride and controlled anger. Officer Mitchell passengers and any crew members still listening, I want to provide complete transparency about this situation. Naomi sat calmly in seat 1, finally ready to reveal the full extent of her identity and authority. She had spent the past hour being treated like a criminal, and now she would show everyone exactly how catastrophic their assumptions had been. My name is Richard Baptiste. I am the founder, chairman, and majority owner of Baptiste Aviation Group. We own 17 airlines across 6 countries, including the aircraft you're sitting on right now. Apex Airlines is one of our subsidiary companies, which means every person who works for this airline ultimately works for me. The silence that followed was deafening. Brad Sullivan's newspaper crumpled in his hands. Derek Walsh, who was still on the aircraft pending his own removal, turned a shade of green that bordered on medical emergency. But Richard wasn't finished. The young woman you've been harassing, accusing of fraud, threatening with arrest, and treating like a criminal is my daughter, Naomi Baptiste. She holds an MBA from the Wharton School of Business, has completed internships at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey Consulting, and is being groomed to eventually take over operational leadership of our airline division. Carlos Rivera's livestream chat exploded with comments. Viewers who had been following the story were sharing it faster than the platform could process. Hashtag Naomi Baptiste began trending alongside hashtag Apex Airlines bias, as people researched the Baptiste Aviation Group and realized the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Margaret Thompson smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been completely vindicated. I knew it, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. I knew this young woman had more class and dignity than everyone trying to tear her down. But the revelation that sent shockwaves through the cabin came when Richard began detailing the specific financial implications of what had occurred. The outfit my daughter is wearing, the inappropriate clothing that supposedly disqualified her from first class, consists of a Brunello Cucinelli cashmere hoodie worth $3,200, vintage Levi's jeans worth $800, and Golden Goose sneakers worth $600. Her accessories include a Hermes Apple Watch band worth $1,200 and a Bottega Veneta phone case worth $400. The math was devastating. Naomi's inappropriate outfit cost more than most people's monthly salary, more than Victoria made in a month, more than Derek's entire wardrobe combined. Dr. Valdez provided legal commentary that resonated with her civil rights expertise. This is a perfect example of how racial bias overrides economic indicators. Even when presented with obvious signs of wealth, the crew defaulted to racist assumptions rather than objective evidence. Emma Rodriguez felt a mixture of vindication and nausea as she processed how completely Victoria had misread the situation. "I tried to tell her," Emma said quietly. "I could see in the system that Ms. Baptiste was flagged as VIP owner family. I tried to warn Victoria, but she told me to stay quiet and learn from her experience." Officer Mitchell, who had initially been called to remove Naomi, now found himself in the surreal position of having removed the wrong person entirely. "Sir," he said into the phone, "I want to apologize on behalf of airport security for the confusion. We were provided with incomplete and inaccurate information by the crew, but the moment that would become the most viral clip of the entire incident came when Richard addressed Brad Sullivan, directly exposing the business relationship that made Brad's discriminatory comments even more damaging. Mr. Sullivan, I believe you work for Henderson Capital Management. Correct?" Brad's face went white. "Yes, sir. Henderson Capital manages approximately $47 million in investment funds for Baptiste Aviation Group. You personally have handled several of our portfolio reviews. So when you supported the discrimination against my daughter, you were essentially endorsing the harassment of your client's family member." The financial implications hit Brad like a physical blow. $47 million in managed assets meant hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual fees for his firm. His discriminatory comments hadn't just been morally wrong, they had been financially catastrophic. Carlos provided real-time commentary for his audience. "So let me get this straight. A hedge fund manager just supported discrimination against the daughter of one of his biggest clients. This is what happens when racism overrides basic business sense." Margaret Ever, the teacher, used the moment for education. Notice how quickly the power dynamics shift when the truth comes out. Notice how the same people who were so confident in their authority 30 minutes ago are now scrambling to apologize and minimize their involvement. But Naomi herself provided the most powerful statement of the revelation phase, speaking with the quiet authority of someone who had just proven that assumptions about power, wealth, and belonging are often catastrophically wrong. "What's interesting to me," Naomi said, her voice carrying across the cabin with perfect clarity, "is that none of this information should matter. My father's wealth, my education, my family's business ownership, none of that should be relevant to whether I deserve to be treated with basic human dignity." Her words hit with the force of moral truth that couldn't be argued or rationalized away. A passenger's right to respectful service shouldn't depend on their net worth or their family connections. It should be standard for everyone. What happened here today was wrong not because I'm wealthy, but because I'm human. The revelation was complete, but its implications were just beginning to unfold. The cabin atmosphere shifted like a tectonic plate adjusting to new geographical realities as the full scope of Richard Baptiste's identity and influence became clear to everyone present. What had started as a routine discrimination incident had revealed itself to be a catastrophic failure of judgment that would have consequences reaching far beyond a single flight. Richard's voice continued from the speakerphone, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "I want everyone to understand the complete context of what occurred here today. Baptiste Aviation Group isn't just another airline company. We're the third largest privately held aviation conglomerate in North America. Our annual revenue exceeds $8 billion. We employ over 40,000 people across our various subsidiaries." Carlos Rivera's fingers flew across his phone screen as he provided real-time fact-checking for his live stream audience. "I'm looking up Baptiste Aviation Group right now, and everything he's saying checks out. This is a massive company. Their subsidiaries include cargo operations, aircraft maintenance pilot training schools, and 17 passenger airlines, including Apex. But the revelation that sent shockwaves through the business community watching the live stream came when Richard began detailing the broader implications of what they had witnessed. The discrimination my daughter experienced today wasn't an isolated incident involving low-level employees. This was institutional failure at multiple levels. The confidence with which the crew acted suggests this behavior has been normalized, possibly encouraged, and certainly not discouraged by management oversight. Dr. Valdez leaned forward, her civil rights attorney instincts recognizing the legal implications. Mr. Baptiste, are you suggesting this represents a pattern of discriminatory behavior rather than isolated employee misconduct? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Richard replied. And I'm announcing today that Baptiste Aviation Group will be conducting comprehensive civil rights audits of all our subsidiaries, starting with Apex Airlines. We're hiring external firms to investigate training protocols, complaint procedures, and employee accountability measures. Margaret Thompson nodded approvingly. Now that's what real accountability looks like. Not just firing the obvious bad actors, but examining the systems that created and protected them. Emma Rodriguez, still processing her rapid promotion and newfound voice, raised a concern that would prove crucial to the investigation. Sir, I think you should know that there are informal policies that aren't written down anywhere. Things that get passed along from senior crew to junior crew about who to watch more carefully, who to question more thoroughly. The admission sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the cabin. But the moment that would become a business school case study in corporate leadership came when Richard addressed the financial implications of discrimination for the entire industry. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share something that every business leader needs to understand. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's financially devastating. The negative publicity from today's incident will cost Apex Airlines millions of dollars in lost revenue, legal fees, and reputation management. Brad Sullivan, who had been calculating his own financial exposure throughout the conversation, finally found his voice. Sir, I want to apologize publicly for my comments earlier. I made serious errors in judgment and I take full responsibility. Richard's response was swift and unforgiving. Mr. Sullivan, your apology is noted, but inadequate. Henderson. Capital Management's contract with Baptiste Aviation Group is hereby terminated effective immediately. We don't do business with organizations whose employees publicly support discrimination. The financial blow was devastating. Brad's face went from pale to gray as he calculated the commission loss, the impact on his firm's reputation, and the likely consequences for his own employment. Carlos provided commentary that resonated with his audience of tech industry followers. This is what happens when your personal prejudices collide with professional responsibilities. This guy just cost his firm millions of dollars because he couldn't keep his racist opinions to himself. But the revelation that would have the most long-term impact came when Naomi herself began to speak about her vision for change, speaking with the authority of someone who would soon have the power to implement industry-wide reforms. I want to share what I've learned from this experience, Naomi said, her voice carrying the weight of both personal hurt and professional determination. The problem isn't just individual bias, it's institutional culture that enables and protects that bias. Richard's voice carried paternal pride mixed with business strategy. Naomi will be leading our new Civil Rights and Customer Experience Division with full authority to investigate, recommend, and implement changes across all Baptiste Aviation Group properties. Emma raised her hand tentatively. Will that include protection for employees who report discrimination? Because I can tell you that crew members are afraid to speak up about problematic behavior from senior staff. Absolutely, Naomi replied. We're implementing anonymous reporting systems, external investigation procedures, and legal protection for whistleblowers. No employee should have to choose between their job and their conscience. The transformation was already beginning. Officer Mitchell, who had initially been called to remove Naomi, was now taking notes about policy failures that had led to the incident. Margaret Thompson was asking about becoming a volunteer diversity trainer. Dr. Valdez was offering legal consultation services for the civil rights audit. Most importantly, passengers throughout the cabin were beginning to understand their own power as witnesses and consumers. They were pulling out phones to document their own experiences, asking questions about airline policies, and demanding accountability from service providers. The identity reveal was complete. but it had accomplished something more significant than just vindicating one passenger. It had created a teachable moment that was being broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people, creating awareness and expectation for change that would ripple through the entire industry. Richard's final words of the revelation phase set the stage for comprehensive transformation. This incident ends with justice for my daughter, but it begins a larger conversation about civil rights in corporate America. We're going to use our platform and resources to ensure this kind of discrimination becomes impossible, not just illegal. The revolution was no longer theoretical. It was operational, funded, and led by people with the power to make real change happen. The complete reversal of power dynamics in the first-class cabin was swift, dramatic, and devastating for those who had wielded authority so confidently just minutes earlier. Victoria Reeves, who had been escorted off the aircraft in handcuffs, was gone, but her absence created a vacuum that revealed the true hierarchy that had always existed but been hidden from view. Derek Walsh stood in the aisle like a man watching his career dissolve in real time. The gate agent who had been so confident in his authority to support crew decisions now found himself face-to-face with the actual owner of the airline, who was documenting every word for potential legal action. Derek Richards' voice came through the speaker with the cold precision of a corporate executioner. I want you to explain to me how you determined that my daughter's valid documents were fraudulent without examining them, without consulting your supervisor, and without following any verification protocols. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sir, the flight attendant said. I was told that... You were told that a black woman in first class must be there illegally. Dr. Valdez interjected her legal training, cutting through Derek's attempts at deflection. And you accepted that assumption without question because it confirmed your own biases. Margaret Thompson, now established as the moral voice of the passenger section, nodded firmly. He didn't question it because he agreed with it. He saw a young black woman and immediately assumed she was a problem to be solved. But the most devastating reversal came when Emma Rodriguez, now senior flight attendant, began to exercise her newfound authority to expose the culture of discrimination she had been forced to witness in silence. Sir Emma said to the phone, Derek has been part of multiple incidents like this. I've seen him support crew members who were clearly discriminating against passengers. He's never once questioned or challenged inappropriate behavior. Carlos Rivera, still documenting everything for his massive live stream audience, provided real-time analysis. So we're not just looking at individual bad actors, we're looking at a network of employees who enabled and protected discriminatory behavior. The power reversal reached its peak when Richard began to detail the immediate consequences for everyone who had participated in or supported the discrimination. Derek, your employment with Apex Airlines is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the property, your access badges are deactivated, and you are banned from all Baptiste Aviation Group facilities, pending the completion of our civil rights investigation. Derek's legs seemed to give out slightly. Sir, please. I have a family. I have bills. I just made an error in judgment. You made a choice, Naomi said, speaking directly to Derek for the first time. You chose to support discrimination rather than verify facts. You chose to trust bias over evidence. Those weren't errors. Those were decisions. Brad Sullivan, watching Derek's professional destruction and calculating his own exposure, attempted to minimize his involvement. Look, I want everyone to know that I never meant to support discrimination. I was just commenting on what I thought I was seeing. Margaret turned in her seat to face Brad directly. What you thought you were seeing was a black woman who didn't belong in first class. That's exactly the kind of thinking that creates and maintains discriminatory systems. But the most powerful moment of the power reversal came when other passengers began to recognize their own complicity in the discrimination they had witnessed. A businessman in row 2, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. I want to apologize. I saw what was happening. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, but silence is complicity. His admission opened floodgates of confession and accountability from passengers who realized they had been bystanders to injustice. Carlos used the moment to provide commentary for his audience about the role of witnesses in stopping discrimination. This is what we all need to understand. If you see discrimination happening and you stay silent, you're part of the problem. Bystanders have power and they have responsibility. Emma, emboldened by her new position and the support of the actual airline owner, began to reveal information that would expose the institutional nature of the discrimination. "Sir, there's something else you need to know. Victoria wasn't acting alone. There are senior crew members who train junior staff to be extra careful with certain passengers. They use coded language, but the message is clear." Richard's voice carried a new edge of controlled fury. "Emma, I want names, dates, and documentation of every incident you're aware of. We're going to root out this culture completely." The reversal was complete when Naomi herself began to articulate how the newfound power would be used not for revenge, but for reform. "I don't want this to be just about punishing bad actors," Naomi said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would soon be implementing policy changes. "I want this to be about creating systems that make discrimination impossible to hide, impossible to ignore, and impossible to continue." Officer Mitchell, who had initially been called to remove Naomi but had ended up removing Victoria, provided the perfect summary of the power dynamic shift. "Ma'am, I've been in airport security for 20 years and I've never seen anything like this. The people who called for help were the ones who needed to be stopped. The revolution was complete, and the new power structure was already beginning to implement changes that would ripple throughout the industry." The accountability phase began immediately and comprehensively as Richard Baptiste demonstrated that real consequences for discrimination required more than just firing individual employees. It required dismantling the entire network of enablement, complicity, and institutional protection that had allowed the behavior to flourish. I want everyone listening to understand what accountability looks like when it's taken seriously. Richard's voice carried across the cabin with the authority of someone announcing policy that would affect thousands of employees and millions of passengers. This isn't just about Victoria and Derek. This is about everyone who created, maintained, or benefited from a culture of discrimination. The first wave of consequences was immediate and public. Captain Rodriguez, who had initially deferred to Victoria's authority without investigating the situation, found himself facing formal discipline that would be documented in his permanent record. Captain Rodriguez: "Richard continued your failure to verify the facts before supporting discriminatory actions represents a breakdown in leadership that cannot be overlooked. You're being reassigned to ground duty pending completion of comprehensive bias training and leadership evaluation." Emma Rodriguez stepped forward to provide testimony that would expand the accountability net far beyond the aircraft. "Sir, I need to report that there are multiple supervisors and trainers who have been teaching discriminatory practices as company policy. This isn't just about frontline employees. This goes up through management levels." Dr. Valdez, recognizing the legal implications of Emma's testimony, provided context that would prove crucial for the investigation. What Emma is describing sounds like institutional discrimination that could expose the company to federal civil rights violations. The Department of Justice takes these patterns very seriously, but the accountability that sent shockwaves through the business community came when Richard addressed the passenger who had actively supported and encouraged the discrimination. "Mr. Sullivan, your public support for discriminatory treatment of my daughter wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was professionally disastrous for your firm. As I mentioned, we're terminating our $47 million investment relationship with Henderson Capital Management." Brad's face went ashen. "Sir, please, that was personal opinion, not company policy. My firm doesn't support discrimination." "Your firm employed someone who publicly supported discrimination," Margaret Thompson interjected. "Your personal opinions become company liability when you express them as a professional representative." Carlos Rivera provided real-time commentary for his live stream audience about the business consequences of public bias. This is why discrimination is bad business. One racist comment just cost this guy's firm millions of dollars in contracts. Racism isn't just morally wrong, it's financially stupid. The accountability expanded when Richard began detailing the comprehensive investigation that would examine years of potential discrimination across the entire airline. We're hiring the civil rights law firm of Morrison Chen and Associates to conduct a complete audit of Apex Airlines. They'll be reviewing every discrimination complaint filed in the past 5 years, interviewing employees at all levels, and examining training materials for biased content. Emma raised her hand again, her confidence growing as she realized her testimony was protected and valued. "Sir, you should know that many discrimination complaints have been buried or dismissed without investigation. There's a culture of intimidation around reporting bias incidents." Naomi, who had been quiet during the accountability announcements, finally spoke with the authority of someone who would soon be implementing industry-wide changes. That culture of intimidation ends today. We're implementing external oversight for all discrimination complaints, legal protection for whistleblowers, and public reporting of resolution statistics. But the most comprehensive accountability came when Richard announced changes that would affect the entire aviation industry, not just Baptiste Aviation Group properties. We're sharing our investigation findings with the Department of Transportation, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Department of Justice. We're also working with civil rights organizations to develop industry standards for bias prevention and accountability. Officer Mitchell, who had witnessed the entire transformation, provided perspective from law enforcement that resonated throughout the cabin. In my 20 years of airport security, I've seen a lot of discrimination incidents that got swept under the rug because passengers didn't have the resources to fight back. This level of accountability is unprecedented. Margaret Thompson, drawing on her decades of experience in education, connected the immediate accountability to broader social change. This is how progress happens, not through gradual acceptance of slightly less discrimination, but through complete rejection of discriminatory behavior and comprehensive consequences for those who engage in it. The accountability reached its climax when other passengers began committing to their own responsibility as witnesses and consumers. Dr. Valdez announced her intention to provide legal consultation for the investigation. "I'm offering my services pro bono to ensure this investigation meets the highest standards for civil rights enforcement." A businessman who had previously remained silent committed to ongoing vigilance. "I fly 50 times a year for work. I'm going to start documenting and reporting every instance of discriminatory behavior I witness. We all have a responsibility to speak up." Carlos made a commitment that would extend the accountability into the digital sphere. "I'm creating a database for passengers to report airline discrimination incidents. If airlines won't track this data, we'll track it ourselves and make it public." But the most powerful accountability statement came from Emma, whose courage in speaking truth to power had catalyzed much of the reform. "I want other airline employees to know that you don't have to participate in discrimination to keep your job. There are good companies and good leaders who will protect you for doing the right thing. And now there are legal protections and external oversight to ensure that retaliation becomes impossible." The accountability phase concluded with Richard's announcement of the timeline for comprehensive reform. All Baptiste Aviation Group employees will complete new bias training within 90 days. All customer service policies will be reviewed and updated within 60 days. All discrimination reporting procedures will be externally audited within 30 days. And all of this will be done transparently with public reporting of progress and results. Naomi added the final element of accountability that would ensure lasting change. "We're also implementing customer feedback systems that specifically track discriminatory treatment with direct escalation to the Civil Rights Division for investigation. Passengers will have power to hold us accountable in real time. The accountability was complete, comprehensive, and designed to prevent future incidents rather than just punish past behavior. It represented a new model for corporate responsibility that would influence industries far beyond aviation. The transformation from crisis to comprehensive reform accelerated as Richard Baptiste began implementing changes that would serve as a model for corporate accountability across industries. The response wasn't just reactive. It was proactive, extensive, and designed to create lasting institutional change. Effective immediately, Richard announced from the speakerphone, his voice carrying the weight of executive authority. Backed by genuine commitment to justice, Baptiste Aviation Group is launching the Dignity in Transit Initiative. This isn't just about fixing problems. This is about setting new industry standards for civil rights in corporate America. Emma Rodriguez, now senior flight attendant, and suddenly finding herself at the center of industry transformation, was asked to lead the frontline employee component of the initiative. "Sir, what would you like me to focus on first? I want you to design training protocols that come from real experience, not corporate theory," Richard replied. "You've seen how discrimination operates in practice. I want you to create training that addresses those realities." Dr. Valdez leaned forward, her civil rights expertise recognizing the significance of what was being announced. "Mr. Baptiste, are you committing to making these training protocols available to other airlines? Because what you're describing could transform the entire industry." "That's exactly what we're doing," Naomi interjected, speaking with the authority of someone who would soon be implementing these changes. "We're open sourcing our bias prevention protocols. Any airline that wants to adopt them will have free access to our training materials, reporting systems, and oversight procedures." Carlos Rivera's live stream audience exploded with commentary as viewers realized they were witnessing the birth of industry-wide reform in real time. "This is incredible," Carlos said to his camera. "We're watching a company voluntarily implement changes that go far beyond legal requirements. This is what leadership looks like." Margaret Thompson, her teacher's instincts recognizing a teachable moment, provided context that resonated with viewers across the country. This is how real change happens, not through minimum compliance with legal requirements, but through maximum commitment to moral principles. But the announcement that generated the most excitement came when Richard detailed the customer empowerment components of the corporate response. "We're launching the Passenger Rights Protection app, which allows travelers to report discrimination in real time with immediate escalation to our Civil Rights Division. Every report will be investigated within 24 hours, with public updates on resolution status." The technology component was revolutionary. Passengers would no longer have to rely on traditional complaint procedures that could be buried in corporate bureaucracy. They would have direct access to accountability mechanisms with transparent tracking and public reporting. Emma raised a concern that proved her growing expertise in discrimination prevention. "Sir, what about retaliation against passengers who file reports? I've seen crew members blacklist passengers who complain." "Excellent question," Naomi replied. "We're implementing legal protection for passengers who file discrimination reports, including rebooking protection complaint, anonymization options, and legal support if they face retaliation from any airline." Officer Mitchell, still processing the comprehensive nature of the response, provided perspective from law enforcement that highlighted the significance of what was being announced. "In my experience, most companies implement minimum changes to avoid liability. This goes far beyond legal protection. This is about creating a culture where discrimination becomes impossible." The corporate response reached its most ambitious phase when Richard announced the financial commitment backing the initiative. Baptiste Aviation Group is committing $50 million over 5 years to the Dignity in Transit initiative. This includes employee training, technology development, external oversight, legal protection funds, and grants for civil rights organizations working on transportation equity. The financial commitment was staggering. It represented more than legal compliance or reputation management. It represented genuine investment in social change. Dr. Valdez provided legal analysis that resonated with her civil rights background. This level of financial commitment creates accountability beyond corporate goodwill. When companies invest this much in bias prevention, they have business incentives to make it work effectively. But the most powerful element of the corporate response came when other passengers began volunteering to participate in the oversight and implementation process. Margaret Thompson volunteered to serve on the passenger advisory board. The businessman who had admitted his own complicity committed to serving as a witness trainer. Even Brad Sullivan, despite his earlier discriminatory comments, asked about participating in rehabilitation programs for business leaders who had supported bias. Carlos concluded his live stream coverage of the corporate response with analysis that captured the historical significance of what had occurred. What started as one passenger being discriminated against has become a comprehensive industry reform initiative. This is what happens when corporations choose accountability over damage control. The corporate response wasn't just fixing a problem. It was pioneering a new model for how businesses could address discrimination proactively, comprehensively, and transparently. As the immediate crisis transformed into comprehensive reform, the personal journeys of everyone involved began to crystallize into stories of growth, accountability, and redemption that would resonate far beyond a single flight incident. The human dimension of institutional change became as important as the policy implementations. Naomi Baptiste sat in seat 1A, no longer defending her right to be there but contemplating the responsibility that came with the platform she had gained through discrimination. The young woman who had boarded the flight as a business school graduate was deplaning as a civil rights leader with the power to implement industry-wide change. "I've been thinking about what this experience has taught me," Naomi said to the cabin, her voice carrying the reflection of someone whose worldview had been both challenged and confirmed. "I always knew discrimination existed, but experiencing it so publicly with so many witnesses has shown me how institutional bias operates even when people know they're being watched." Richard's voice from the phone carried paternal pride mixed with recognition of his daughter's evolution. "Naomi, you handled this situation with more grace and strategic thinking than executives twice your age. You turned personal attack into public education and individual humiliation into institutional accountability." Margaret Thompson, who had emerged as the moral voice of the passenger section, provided perspective that connected personal growth to broader social change. Watching this young woman maintain her dignity while documenting injustice has been a masterclass in effective activism. She didn't just defend herself, she created a teachable moment for everyone. But the most significant personal transformation belonged to Emma Rodriguez, whose courage in speaking truth to power had evolved from junior crew member to senior leadership position to civil rights advocate in the span of 2 hours. "I want to share something with other airline employees who might be watching," Emma said, addressing Carlos's live stream camera directly. "For 6 months I stayed quiet about discrimination I witnessed because I was afraid of retaliation. Today I learned that speaking up doesn't destroy your career. Staying silent destroys your conscience." Emma's transformation was particularly powerful because it demonstrated how institutional change required not just policy modifications, but personal courage from individuals willing to challenge corrupt systems from within. Dr. Valdez, whose legal expertise had provided crucial context throughout the incident, reflected on the intersection of personal experience and professional responsibility. "As a civil rights attorney, I've seen hundreds of discrimination cases, but witnessing one unfold in real time reminded me why this work matters. Every case represents a human being deserving dignity and respect." Carlos Rivera, whose decision to live stream the incident had amplified its impact exponentially, grappled with the responsibility that came with wielding social media influence. "I started filming this as a tech journalist documenting corporate bias. I'm ending it as a witness to historic accountability. This experience has taught me about the power and responsibility of digital platforms to expose injustice. Even the passengers who had initially remained silent during the discrimination were processing their own growth and accountability. The businessman in row 2, who had eventually admitted his complicity, spoke with the humility of someone whose assumptions had been thoroughly challenged. I've spent my career in environments where I was taught that keeping your head down and avoiding conflict was professional behavior. Today, I learned that silence in the face of injustice isn't professionalism, it's cowardice. Margaret Thompson, drawing on her decades as an educator, helped facilitate conversations about personal growth that would have lasting impact beyond the immediate incident. What we've all learned today is that discrimination thrives in environments where good people choose comfort over courage. Every person who spoke up made it harder for bias to hide. But the most complex personal journey belonged to Brad Sullivan, whose discriminatory comments had cost his firm millions of dollars and exposed his own prejudices to a national audience. His path to redemption would require more than apologies. It would require fundamental changes in perspective and behavior. I need to acknowledge that my comments today weren't just errors in judgment. Brad said, his voice carrying the weight of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. They were reflections of unconscious bias that I need to address through education, self-reflection, and commitment to change. Richard's response to Brad demonstrated how personal accountability could be balanced with opportunities for growth. Mr. Sullivan, while our business relationship is terminated, I want you to know that we'll be developing rehabilitation programs for business leaders who want to address their own biases. Redemption is possible, but it requires genuine commitment to change. Naomi provided the most powerful reflection on personal growth, speaking with the wisdom of someone whose individual experience had become a catalyst for collective transformation. I've learned that dignity isn't something you earn through credentials or connections, she said, her voice carrying across the cabin with quiet authority. Dignity is something you possess as a human being, something that should never be questioned or qualified. What happened to me today was wrong, not because I'm wealthy or educated or connected, but because I'm human. Her words captured the universal truth that had emerged from a very specific incident, that respect and dignity should be standard for everyone regardless of their background, appearance, or social status. The personal growth that had emerged from crisis would fuel the institutional changes being implemented, ensuring that reform would be grounded in human experience rather than abstract policy. The ripple effects of the Apex Airlines incident began spreading through the aviation industry within hours of Carlos Rivera's live stream ending, as competitors, regulators, and industry organizations recognized that what had started as a single discrimination incident had evolved into a comprehensive blueprint for institutional change. The first airline to respond was Coastal Airways, whose CEO issued a statement within 6 hours of the incident going viral. We are immediately implementing bias prevention training for all customer service employees and installing external oversight mechanisms for discrimination complaints. The dignity standards pioneered by Baptiste Aviation Group will be adopted across our operations. Richard Baptiste's voice carried satisfaction as he provided updates on the industry response from his corporate office. We've received calls from 12 airline CEOs in the past 4 hours. They're all requesting access to our bias prevention protocols and asking for consultation on implementing similar accountability measures. Dr. Valdez, who had become an unofficial spokesperson for the legal implications of the incident, provided analysis that highlighted the broader significance of the industry transformation. What we're seeing is unprecedented. Usually, companies change policies only after being forced to by lawsuits or regulatory action. Here we're seeing voluntary adoption of higher standards driven by public awareness and moral leadership. The Federal Aviation Administration announced within 24 hours that they would be reviewing discrimination prevention requirements for all commercial airlines using the Baptiste Aviation Group model as a potential template for industry-wide regulations. The FAA statement is remarkable, Emma Rodriguez observed during a follow-up interview. They're essentially saying that voluntary corporate leadership is driving federal policy development. That's the opposite of how change usually happens in regulated industries. Carlos Rivera, whose live stream had become the most watched airline incident video in social media history, provided ongoing coverage of the industry transformation. Major airlines are falling over themselves to announce bias prevention initiatives. United, Delta, American. They're all scrambling to implement changes before they become the next viral discrimination incident. But the most significant industry change came when the International Air Transport Association announced the development of global standards for passenger dignity and civil rights, with Baptiste Aviation Group serving as the pilot program for implementation. Margaret Thompson, who had emerged as a powerful voice for passenger rights during the incident, was invited to serve on the Industry Standards Development Committee. What excites me most is that these changes aren't being driven by lawyers or executives. They're being driven by passengers, crew members, and witnesses who decided to speak truth to power. The transformation accelerated when pilot training schools began incorporating bias prevention into their curricula, recognizing that cockpit authority included responsibility for challenging discriminatory behavior from crew members. We're seeing systemic change at every level of the industry, Naomi reported during her first week as head of the Civil Rights and Customer Experience Division. Flight schools, maintenance programs, ground operations training. Everyone is recognizing that passenger dignity has to be embedded in operational culture, not just policy documents. The international component of the transformation became evident when European airlines began requesting consultation from Baptiste Aviation Group about implementing similar accountability measures. The incident had resonated globally as a model for how corporations could address discrimination proactively rather than reactively. Officer Mitchell, who had witnessed the entire incident from law enforcement perspective, provided insight into how the transformation was affecting airport security protocols. We're seeing airports update their training on when to intervene in passenger disputes. The assumption that crew members are always right is being replaced with requirements to investigate discrimination claims independently. The technology industry responded by developing apps and platforms that would support the passenger rights protections pioneered by Baptiste Aviation Group. We're seeing innovation in accountability technology that goes far beyond airlines, Carlos reported. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores. Everyone is asking how they can implement real-time discrimination reporting and response systems. But the most powerful indicator of industry transformation came when passengers themselves began demanding higher standards, using the Apex Airlines incident as a reference point for acceptable treatment. Passengers are no longer accepting discriminatory treatment as normal, Dr. Valdez observed. They're pulling out phones referencing the Baptiste standards and demanding accountability. Corporate America is learning that discrimination has become too expensive to ignore. The industry transformation concluded with the announcement of the annual Dignity in Transit Awards, recognizing airlines, airports, and service providers that demonstrated exceptional commitment to passenger rights and bias prevention. What started as one passenger's refusal to accept discrimination has become an industry-wide commitment to justice, Richard announced during the award program launch. This is how lasting change happens. One courageous person inspiring institutional transformation that benefits everyone. The revolution had become the new standard, and the aviation industry would never be the same. The first-class cabin of Apex Airlines Flight 847 from New York to Miami looked identical to the aircraft where Naomi Baptiste had been humiliated 6 months earlier, but everything about the experience had been transformed. The seats were the same, the layout unchanged, but the culture had been revolutionized from the ground up. Naomi settled into seat 1A with a mixture of nostalgia and satisfaction, watching as the new crew operated under the protocols she had designed following her experience with Victoria Reeves. Emma Rodriguez, now Chief of Customer Experience for the entire Apex fleet, conducted the pre-flight briefing with a confidence that came from knowing her authority was backed by genuine commitment to passenger dignity. Good morning, passengers. I'm Emma Rodriguez, and our crew is committed to ensuring every person on this aircraft receives respectful professional service. If you experience any treatment that falls short of that standard, please use the Passenger Rights app to report it immediately. We take discrimination seriously, and we respond to it quickly. The announcement would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, but it had become standard across all Baptiste Aviation Group properties. The transformation was complete, measurable, and sustainable. Margaret Thompson, now a regular volunteer trainer for the bias prevention program, occupied seat 3B with a smile of satisfaction. The retired teacher had found new purpose in her 70s, helping design educational materials that were being used by airlines around the world. "I never thought I'd be traveling so much at my age," she told Naomi during boarding. "But this work has given me energy I didn't know I still had." Carlos Rivera was in seat 2C, returning from a civil rights conference where he had been honored for his role in documenting and amplifying the original incident. His live stream had become a case study in responsible journalism and the power of social media to create accountability. The tech journalist had evolved into a leading voice for digital activism and corporate responsibility. The most remarkable transformation belonged to the passengers themselves. Where 6 months earlier, travelers might have ignored or even supported discriminatory treatment, the cabin now contained individuals who actively looked out for each other's dignity and rights. A young Hispanic businessman in row 4 had already downloaded the Passenger Rights app and was explaining its features to his seatmate. An elderly black woman in row 2 was being welcomed warmth by crew members who saw her humanity rather than making assumptions about her economic status. But the most powerful symbol of transformation was visible in the crew interactions themselves. The junior flight attendants moved with confidence, knowing they were protected and encouraged to challenge inappropriate behavior. The senior crew members operated with humility, understanding that their authority came with responsibility for justice rather than just policy enforcement. Naomi pulled out her phone and sent a text to her father. "Dad, the culture change is complete. This feels like a completely different airline." His response came immediately. "That's because it is. You didn't just change policies, you changed hearts and minds. That's the only way change lasts." The transformation was indeed complete, but its ripple effects were just beginning. As Flight 847 reached cruising altitude, Naomi experienced a moment of profound recognition that her journey had come full circle, but at a higher level of understanding and purpose. The same route, the same seat, the same airline had become the setting for a completely different story about human dignity, corporate responsibility, and the power of courage to create lasting change. Dr. Patricia Valdez, who had been instrumental in providing legal context during the original incident, was now serving as the independent monitor for Baptiste Aviation Group's civil rights implementation. She occupied the same row where she had provided legal commentary 6 months earlier, but now she was conducting her quarterly assessment of the company's progress in bias prevention and accountability. Naomi Dr. Valdez said during the flight, "I want you to know that what you accomplished here has become a model for corporate civil rights enforcement worldwide. The United Nations is studying your protocols for potential international implementation." The recognition was gratifying, but Naomi found even more satisfaction in the smaller daily indicators of cultural change. The crew interactions were natural rather than performative. The passenger mix was more diverse, suggesting that the airline's commitment to inclusivity was attracting travelers who had previously avoided the carrier. The training materials visible in crew areas reflected real-world scenarios rather than abstract policy language. Carlos Rivera, now a leading voice in digital accountability journalism, was documenting the anniversary flight for a follow-up story about the sustainability of corporate change. "What impresses me most," he told his audience during a brief live stream, "is that these improvements have become normal operations rather than special efforts. That's how you know real change has occurred." Margaret Thompson, whose volunteer work with the Bias Prevention Program had earned her a permanent advisory position, represented the ongoing community involvement that ensured the changes would outlast any single administration or policy cycle. "I've seen a lot of social movements in my lifetime," she reflected. "The ones that last are the ones that create systems rather than just moments." But the most meaningful full-circle moment came when a young black businessman in row 5 was welcomed aboard with the same warmth and professionalism that would greet any passenger. 6 months earlier, his presence might have triggered the same assumptions and discrimination that Naomi had faced. Today, he was simply another valued customer whose business was appreciated and whose dignity was protected. Emma Rodriguez, conducting her rounds as Chief of Customer Experience, stopped to check on all passengers with genuine care rather than perfunctory politeness. "Is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable?" she asked each passenger, and the question carried authentic concern rather than scripted customer service language. The flight that had begun as a journey of personal vindication had evolved into a testament to institutional transformation. The full circle wasn't just about returning to the same physical space. It was about occupying that space with the knowledge that it had been fundamentally changed for everyone who would follow. As the aircraft descended toward Miami, Naomi realized that her story had become larger than her individual experience. It had become proof that change was possible, justice was achievable, and dignity was non-negotiable. The legacy of what became known as the Apex Airlines transformation extended far beyond a single company or even a single industry, creating ripple effects that would influence corporate culture, civil rights enforcement, and individual courage for generations to come. The story had evolved from personal injustice to universal inspiration, from individual accountability to institutional change. Naomi Baptiste, now recognized as one of the leading voices in corporate civil rights, used her platform to inspire others facing discrimination to document their experiences. Demand accountability and never accept treatment that diminished their human dignity. Her speeches at business schools and civil rights conferences always returned to the same fundamental principle. Respect isn't earned through credentials or connections. Respect is owed to every person simply because they exist. The Baptist standard had been adopted by over 200 companies across dozens of industries, creating a new benchmark for how organizations could address bias proactively rather than reactively. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and service providers worldwide were implementing similar accountability measures, recognition that dignity was a business imperative rather than just a moral obligation. Emma Rodriguez had become a sought-after consultant for companies wanting to implement whistleblower protections and employee empowerment programs. Her story of transformation from fearful junior employee to confident leader inspired workers across industries to speak truth to power. "You don't have to choose between your job and your conscience," she told audiences. "Good companies will protect you for doing the right thing, and companies that don't protect you don't deserve your loyalty." Margaret Thompson's volunteer work had expanded into a national program pairing retired educators with corporations seeking to develop bias prevention training. The program, called Dignity Teachers, had trained over 10,000 corporate employees and had waiting lists of both volunteers and companies seeking their services. Carlos Rivera's documentation of the incident had become a masterclass in responsible journalism and the power of social media to create accountability. His techniques for real-time fact-checking, witness protection, and audience engagement were being taught in journalism schools as models for digital activism and corporate oversight. But the most powerful legacy belonged to the countless individuals who had been inspired to speak up against injustice in their own lives and communities. Passengers who refused to accept discriminatory treatment, employees who challenged biased policies, witnesses who documented inappropriate behavior rather than remaining silent. The courage demonstrated on one flight had multiplied across millions of interactions. The annual Dignity in Transit Awards had evolved into a global celebration of organizations and individuals who demonstrated exceptional commitment to civil rights and human dignity. The ceremony honored not just major corporate initiatives, but also individual acts of courage by ordinary people who chose justice over comfort. As Naomi reflected on the transformation during the anniversary flight, she realized that the most important legacy wasn't the policies that had been changed or the systems that had been implemented. The most important legacy was the proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as normal. "We didn't just change one airline," she told the audience at the first annual Dignity in Transit Awards. "We changed the conversation about what's possible when people choose courage over silence, accountability over comfort, and dignity over discrimination." That conversation will continue long after we're gone, carried forward by every person who refuses to accept that this is just how things are. The legacy was living, growing, and transforming lives daily across the globe. If you've ever been treated like you didn't belong, this story was for you. If you've ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up, let this be your inspiration to find your voice. And if you've ever doubted that one person can make a difference, remember Naomi Baptiste, who turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Share your own experiences in the comments below, because when we speak up, we build a world where dignity travels with everyone.